All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Bridget Dooney. I'm a grad program specialist, and I'm joined today by Esther Rolf, who will be giving a pre-research advising session about her research. Esther will be joining CU Boulder as an assistant professor of computer science in fall of 2024. And her research blends methodological and applies techniques to study design and machine learning and algorithms and systems with an emphasis on usability, data efficiency, and fairness. Some of her specific projects span developing algorithms and infrastructure for reliable environmental monitoring using a machine learning, responsible, and fair algorithm design and use, and the influence of data acquisition and representation on the efficacy and applicability of machine learning systems. Esther is currently a fellow funded by the Harvard Data Science Initiative and the Center for Research on Computation and Society. She completed her PhD in computer science at UC Berkeley in 2022, where she was advised by Ben Reck and Michael I. Jordan. Esther's PhD was supported by an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, a Google Research Fellowship, and a UC Berkeley Stonebreaker Fellowship. Esther has won Best Paper Awards at ICML in 2018 and the Workshop on AI for Social Good at Neural IPS in 2019. And now I'm going to pass it off to Esther to start her presentation.
Great. Thank you, Bridget. That was indeed the long form bio. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all here. So I'm currently in Cambridge, so I appreciate that everyone is on Zoom. And I'm very excited to share with you all a little bit about my research. Let me get a screen share going here. Okay. And could someone just confirm that you see the slides?
Yep, can see them. Thank you.
We're all good.
Great, thank you. Okay. So Bridget gave a great intro. The most important thing is I am joining CU as an assistant professor of computer science next fall. So this slide deck is mostly an overview of my research and a little bit of kind of vision and what my lab will be like when I get there. So majority of the slides in the talk will be about the actual research I do and a little bit of motivation for why I do it. And then briefly at the end, I will kind of go over what it means to be a part of my lab and kind of give some general advice for people who are considering or starting out in their PhDs. So my research is in statistical and geospatial machine learning. And I work in this field because I am really excited about the immense potential for machine learning to help us make sense of just the insane amount of data that we have collected around the world from all sorts of different sensors like drones or satellite imagery, but also from our phone or existing data sets like medical data sets. And all of this data can really help us monitor environmental, ecological, and social phenomena. So to highlight two projects I'm working on right now, both with remote sensing data from drone and satellite imagery, this can help us map tree canopy height. So basically like how tall tree cover is over large amounts of space, or it can help us detect isolated objects like small-scale artisanal mining across the globe. So this information is important because it's this abundant amount of data, and knowing where tree canopy height is changing or where artisanal mines are showing up can help us help people in general make better decisions and better policy programs for everyone. At the same time that there is this huge potential for machine learning to help out, just applying a machine learning algorithm out of the box to a socially relevant problem is not guaranteed to confer any kind of benefit or usefulness. And despite a ton of incredible progress that the field of statistical machine learning has made, a lot of that progress is actually within what I would call kind of the gray box of machine learning. Hopefully you can see my pointer here. And often when we apply these learning algorithms that work really well in kind of these gray box settings, algorithms that are developed and analyzed in the lab, but we apply them to the real world, they can actually exacerbate or introduce harms or unfairness due to these algorithmic decisions being made at scale. Or more likely, they can just be kind of ineffective at solving the real world problem at hand because the real world doesn't necessarily look like the conditions these algorithms were designed for. So in my research, I'm hoping to achieve this benefit from these machine learning systems. And if benefit or use is our goal, these ML systems need to function within this broader context of design and use. And so we're taking the kind of purview of this gray box and really expanding it to what is going on around this algorithm. And in general, making this happen is a complex and interdisciplinary goal. As computer scientists, this means that we need to kind of expand our scope of analysis and design to not only include the algorithm itself, but to take into account factors like the structures and limitations in our input data, as well as downstream use cases of our machine learning models or predictions. And this is really the framing of research that I'm going to talk about today, is where do we wrap computer science and statistics around this gray box? And so the talk will have two main parts in research. The first, I'll talk about machine learning algorithms that are specifically tailored for remotely sensed data. And in the second part, we'll take a bit more of a focus on kind of wrapping that gray box more generally by thinking about what properties of data we need for fair and representative machine learning outputs. After that, I will synthesize some future directions in this general theme of context-driven machine learning design and analysis, which I think are some of the most exciting questions moving forward. And at the end, I'll conclude with just a little tiny bit of advice for people who are considering or starting out in their PhDs, and then we should have ample time for some unstructured Q&A at the end. Hopefully this sounds good. We're going to dive into part one now, which is looking at machine learning and how we can tailor those algorithms specifically for remotely sensed data. And in particular, we're going to look at satellite imagery and machine learning. There's currently over 1,000 satellites orbiting around us as we're all on this Zoom call. They are collecting over 90 terabytes of data every day. That's a huge amount of data that can help us monitor our world and act in it, from domains like environmental monitoring, where satellite imagery can help track species populations, map built infrastructure, and biodiversity, to real-time disaster response, where satellite imagery and machine learning models that can be applied to those imagery can help estimate damages from natural disasters with building detection like you see on the right here. And it can also help find and prioritize some of the most vulnerable or affected areas so that relief can be sent to the right places as soon as possible. And on a broad global policy sense, satellite imagery and machine learning have been combined to estimate food security and crop yield predictions, as well as generating fine-grained poverty estimates across countries. So a huge amount of potential for some real-world impact here. And as satellite imagery and machine learning, this technology is getting better and better. It's increasingly used in consequential domains like we just saw. It's incredibly important that we develop the machine learning models to be accurate, efficient, and accessible specifically for this task. So we're basically thinking about what is within this green arrow. We want that to be something that is specifically good at working with satellite imagery. so that these maps are accurate and so that we can run this whole pipeline quickly, something that would be really important, for example, in disaster response. At the moment, though, generating predictions from satellite imagery with machine learning models can be quite costly, both in terms of the computation required, so GPUs or cloud computing, as well as really depending right now quite a bit on some machine learning expertise. Not every government lab or even not every research lab is going to have the ML expertise to train and run these models. And as a result, each individual model that gets published ends up being very domain specific and basically predicting one thing very well. At the same time, though, it's the same imagery that carries information about multiple different domains. This one image that you see here carries information about the percent tree cover in the image, the average income of people in the image, as well as things like the total amount of road length. And so it's the underlying set of imagery that carries all this information. Why do we need 5 different models to predict these 5 different things? Well, my collaborators and I questioned that, and this is how we thought of the machine learning system Mosaics, which we built for multitask observation with satellite imagery and random kitchen sinks. So you see kind of the overview diagram of how Mosaics works here. It's one set of imagery on the left that gets converted into one representation of that imagery. So one matrix X. The same matrix X can help researcher 1 on top here predict forest cover in places that their original data is lacking. But it's that same matrix that helps researcher 2 on the bottom predict population density in locations they didn't originally have data. And so the multitask aspect of this is that it's the same matrix X that's helpful for these 2 tasks. And you can imagine having even more arrows and how widely this will parallelize. So to run through how Mosaics works, I'm going to orient this around actually 3 design principles that we had in building it. The first of those is accessibility. We wanted the prediction step for users to be simple and computationally efficient. We didn't want people to have a PhD in machine learning to be able to use this technology. So from the user side, they'll take the data that they already have. So say forest cover density in certain locations where they have data, they'll match that to the rows of the matrix that correspond to those images in places they have data, and then solve just a linear regression to get these weights here, beta. And then they can use these linear weights to run forward the prediction in areas where they don't have the Y values, but we do have images and hence rows of this matrix X. And so the idea is that all we're really requiring of the user side is just a linear regression step. This comes alongside a generalizability. It's the same process, the same linear regression, and the same underlying data that is used to predict forest cover or population density or any other variable that is of interest. And all of this is enabled by an algorithmic simplicity. So at this point, you might be wondering, okay, a lot of the magic is actually not going on necessarily in this linear regression step, but in how we translate the imagery into this matrix X, which is in machine learning terms, an unsupervised embedding. So I'm about to go through that here on this next slide. And what this slide is showing us is how we take any one of these images and output a vector representation of that image. So a d-dimensional vector here on the right, where every element is just a real number. And so I'll walk you through this. If you happen to be familiar with convolutional neural networks or these kind of building blocks in computer vision, you'll recognize a lot of them here, but the this very simplified version of a convolutional neural network, easy enough that we can just walk it through it. So we start with D random filters that we'll take from our training data. So for each of these random filters, think it's like a really, really small sub image, 3 by 3 pixels and 3 channels deep for RGB. For each of these random filters, we'll compare that to our sample image, basically take a moving dot product, a convolution, which is this first step here, and then a nonlinearity. And now we get a map that is about the same shape as our original sample image, but 1 channel deep. And what these values are telling us is basically how much did this small patch light up in this entire image. So the particular filter that generated this feature response map in blue and red looks like it is kind of like a shadow and edges are being picked up. But if we took a different random filter, we would get a different feature response map corresponding to different things in the image. Once we have this, we're going to average over the XY dimension here, or kind of equivalently take a sum. It's kind of the same up to a constant. And then that will be one element of this feature vector. And importantly, we're doing this for D random filters, and D is pretty big, like in the thousands. So we'll end up doing this process many, many times to get a pretty rich representation of what types of pixel values are in this image. We'll do this for all of the N images in our data set, and now each of those images is a row in this matrix, which is of dimension N times D. And then our label set will be kind of generated ground truth labels. So Y here would be like the percent tree cover in this image and all the other images behind it. And from this, we will solve the linear regression that you saw from the previous slide. Everything I'll show you for this part of the talk uses a ridge regression, which is what this penalty on the weights is included for. But really the important thing here is that this entire process points toward this final optimization problem. And that means that we can generate these features once, generate matrix X, and kind of be done with the imagery itself. All we need to publish is the features. If we contrast this with deep learning models like convolutional neural networks, we need then to not only optimize over the linear part of the model, but also everything inside of the model itself. And so we have this backwards dependence where we can't just look at the images once and be done. What we will in general get from a CNN is a model that's much more complex, much more expressive. And we want to make sure that the simplicity that we're getting with the random convolutional features and mosaics is not actually coming at a great cost to accuracy. So here you see that performance comparison. Our model is in green, and a fine-tuned ResNet 18, which is a convolutional neural network, is in blue. R squared is going to be between 0 and 1, and higher is better. And you can see that on these 7 different tasks that we're trying to predict, Mosaics is in general a few R squared points behind the ResNet. But if we put this in the context of the training resources it took to generate these models, Mosaics ran in 2 minutes on a laptop, versus for each of these 7 bars, this took 8 hours to run on an AWS instance with a pretty big GPU. So it's immediately a huge difference in what type of resources are required to get this sort of performance. It's worth noting that you don't necessarily get this sort of performance for free with any unsupervised embedding. In orange, you see a model that's also an unsupervised embedding of satellite imagery, kind of more similar in training time to Mosaics, but much worse performance. And this kind of begs the question a little bit of how can we get performance that is looking kind of so unreasonably high with all of this simplification algorithmically and computationally? Well, one answer that I think is kind of illuminating is if we look at where these deep learning and computer vision networks do best. And so many of them are designed for natural imagery. And so natural imagery, think kind of anything you could take a photo of with your phone is fair game. In particular, these two images from the top are from a data set called ImageNet, which is very kind of famous and foundational in machine learning computer vision. A model that performs well on ImageNet needs to be able to classify that both of those images are a red panda, even though one is kind of this zoomed out view of the entire panda, and one is this super zoomed in view of its face. In contrast, if we look at these satellite images, there's a lot of structure in them. There's a lot of scale and orientation invariance. The size of a house is roughly the same in one image or the other, or the color of trees or the width of highways. And these structures can help us explain why kind of simpler and more structured, but smaller machine learning models can actually be helpful, specifically for satellite imagery. So I could go into the specifics of that project for much longer, and maybe one day I'll get to do that. But for today, I want to zoom back out a little bit and reorient what we were looking at there. So we have this great potential for remotely sensed data and geospatial machine learning to merge together to help aid global monitoring. But there's a lot of key challenges of working with geospatial and remotely sensed data for machine learning. One of the big ones there is the barriers of use that keep people from accessing this type of technology. And Mosaics is designed to really reduce many of those barriers. Even for folks that are working in machine learning labs, as I am, there are still a lot of challenges to using and developing the latest and greatest machine learning here. One of these is in just the quality, coverage, and quantity of data that we might have. So I talked a little bit about using these models to fill in gaps where data doesn't exist. Well, if data doesn't exist there, it's actually pretty hard to learn a machine learning model that works in those regions. And on top of that, we may have data in a bunch of different regions, but that data might have different quality. It might come from different types of sensors. And in general, fusing this type of heterogeneity or kind of the data is not all the same is a challenge in machine learning. And while these are important challenges in geospatial and machine learning with remotely sensed data, I would actually say these are problems of that occur a lot in general machine learning, these problems of incomplete representation. Kind of my gray box of an algorithm just tells me what to do when I input Y and output X. It doesn't necessarily tell me what to do if my data comes from sources of different quality, or if my test distribution that I want to use my model on, if there are multiple different groups in that are all very important. And so in the second part of the talk, we will kind of take a little bit more abstracted and general machine learning view on things toward this question that arises in these real world problems, though, which is if we want to think about what sorts of representation and data are important, how can we explain the way that our input training data explains or limits what our machine learning model can do? And so let's orient this with a specific concern we might have about machine learning models and their performance in the real world. And this is that we're often looking at learning systems that have low error on average, but they might fail to perform well across salient subgroups. So here, think this model y is f of x can be anything. It can be our satellite model from the previous slides. It might be a model that predicts some medical outcome based on patient conditions. And in general, our model is performing really well over the population. So the gray bar is like the error rate over the entire United States. But it's possible that despite low population error, there are really bad errors on certain groups in the population. For example, for a medical system that might fail for young women in Colorado, that would be a problem. But in the whole of the United States, maybe young women in Colorado are actually a really small part of the overall population. So that kind of gets washed out when we take this average performance. So this isn't only a concern in the cartoon that I've drawn here. This was showcased very famously by the Gender Shade study, which looked at commercially available facial recognition software and audited their errors, finding significantly worse performance for darker skinned females. If anyone is working in machine learning and hasn't read this study, I highly recommend. The question then is, why is this the case? Why are these gaps in performance so high? Well, this can be in part due to underrepresentation of these groups in training data. And in fact, another research paper titled Actionable Auditing looked at the reactions that these companies on the left had to the publication of the Gender Shade study. So Gender Shades came out, they said, okay, performance is really bad for these groups. And what do you think the companies did? Well, they updated their models. And in particular, most of those updates seem to be driven by data work, in particular, getting diverse data to try and increase the model performance for those subgroups. So this now begs the question, did everything have to happen in this order? Is it because some subgroups are really small parts of the population? Did they get missed during data collection and during training? Well, in a research paper from a couple of years ago from the International Conference of Machine Learning, my collaborators and I showed that actually underrepresenting small groups in our training data set is inconsistent with even this population or average accuracy objective. And with slightly limited time, I'm going to run you through kind of the framework by which we do this. There may be a few kind of statistical notions, but hopefully everything will be clear from the pictures. So we're going to model our population as made up of G different groups. So basically, if we have this image of our population on the right here, the gamma is just telling us what fraction of the population is each color. So the gammas will sum to 1. This is just describing the population that exists and is given to us. We also have a data set of medical records or of images from certain places. And each instance in that data set is also associated with a color or a group. And note that the proportions of data instances we have in our training data does not necessarily have to reflect the proportions that are actually prevalent in the population. And in particular, we'll think about being able to change the alphas or the fraction from each group in the training data, but we can't change anything about the true populations. We can't change these gammas on the top. And so what this allows us to do is now incorporate the option to change these data set distributions as part of our learning optimization. So if anyone's familiar with empirical risk minimization, this inner part here is kind of, in some sense, the bread and butter of machine learning. where we're trying to pick a function f hat that minimizes the error on our population. So importantly, minimizing error on our population that exists with fixed gamma. And generally, we'll try and find the f hat, the function that minimizes the loss on this data. Think kind of picking the best neural network out of a set of neural networks. In this framework, we're also going to allow ourselves to tune parameters of the data set. So we can choose how many samples we want to get from each of these G different groups. And that can be part of our optimization procedure, but always with the goal of having the most accurate classifier for the distribution in red, for that fixed distribution. So we're actually looking at that gray bar from before. So in order to perform this optimization, important thing to note is that we can look at the population level accuracy, or we can equivalently look at the accuracy on all of these different groups, and then average those weighted by their prevalence in the population. So this is just saying, we have a low error rate for the yellow group, and the yellow group is a lot of our population. So that low error rate is going to contribute a lot to the gray average error. Now we need to think about how the way that we choose this data set allocation, where we choose to get training samples from, how does that affect the error rates on each of these different groups? And generally, we're going to get a curve like you see on the lower right here, that as we increase the number of training points in our data set, the error for group G, here we're looking at the purple group, should go down. And this should go down as a function of both just generally getting more data and specifically getting more training data from group G. This specific parameterization is captured by the form you see up top here. And in particular, what's going to be relevant in the next slide is this sigma G, which is a parameter basically saying how important is it that I have data in my training set from group G to predict well on group G specifically. And all of this is building up to be able to rigorously prove this next result, which is that when that sigma G term, the importance of data from your within group, when that's equal across groups, which is basically this nice symmetric case that you wouldn't really know what to say other than that before really diving into data. When sigma is equal across groups, the data set that allows us to optimize for that population level accuracy, that's actually optimized by a data set allocation that has higher representation from small groups than the population proportion. So that's what this picture on the bottom is showing you. Any of the groups that are smaller than 1 over the number of groups, so smaller than 1/4 of the population here, the optimal training data set would actually sample those at higher than their sigma. And so there's some intuitive reasons why you think this might make sense. There's also kind of, if you stare at this problem long enough, you might think, okay, yeah, the rare examples are actually the really valuable ones. Those are the ones I want to learn the most from. The nice thing about this framework is we can show exactly that with the formality of mathematics. Before we did this project, scaling laws basically analyzed kind of what would average population error look like as you increase the number of training points. And generally, error will go down as you get a bigger training set, right? We see this with bigger and bigger machine learning models. Our work adds many different dimensions to this and allows us to talk about not only average error, but error for different parts of our population, and to have a much more nuanced description of how that changes under different data sets, not only from different sizes, but also from different distributions and types of diversity. So this is an important step forward there, but there's a lot more to be said in terms of what representation in data might mean, just beyond who is actually in an existing data frame. And I'm next going to quickly outline a few future directions and what other aspects of representation in data we might be able to use and to actually work with to make better context-situated machine learning. So the first of those is pretty close to what we were looking at before. It's something about numerical inclusion. So basically, who is in the sample frame? And what you see here is the machine learning model trained with different amounts of training data on the x-axis, but the three different curves, the data is coming from different sample frames. And by that, what I mean is the data can be collected from one of these three strategies here. So what we're doing is predicting house price in Arizona, and we're simulating different ways that that training data could be collected. So one is to only get data from these big clusters in green. One is to get training data from these kind of smaller but more scattered clusters in red. And a third approach that would be very expensive in practice would be to uniformly at randomly sample points from all of Arizona. And the idea is that if we can know kind of how our performance will change as we change these different sampling strategies, basically where each of these curves will be, then we can make good decisions about the cost trade-offs of getting this data versus the performance that it will provide. This idea of kind of who is in the sample frame and where did the sample data come from is also really important in some of these questions from satellite imagery and machine learning from earlier, where in particular, we're often training a model wherever we have available data. We may only have good tree canopy height data in some regions, but we really want that model to apply to a wider set of regions. And so this question of kind of where is the data close enough or who is close enough to being in the sample frame becomes a really big question. In a slightly different sense of representation, so this isn't just about kind of one data point is taken from a specific group or a specific place. This is looking at from each data observation that is recorded or remotely sensed, what is and is not actually captured in that specific data observation. And really asking this question is important because if we can understand how data is only a partial representation of the world, it can help us uncover limitations of data-driven models from the outset. So the figure you see here is from a paper that came out earlier this summer, where my colleagues and I were looking at satellite-based poverty prediction. And so kind of think models like the one from the first half of this talk, we actually used exactly that model to predict poverty levels across the globe. One of the findings of our study is that a lot of the signal that you get about predicting poverty with these models is actually can be explained by just predicting levels of urbanization. And this, while this makes sense, urbanization is very visually apparent from satellite imagery, and it's also very correlated with wealth in parts of the world. This might mean that a satellite model will make structured errors, for example, over predicting wealth in urban regions, and policies that might use this information to, for example, distribute aid might miss parts of the urban poor as a result. So it's really important that we know where these structural errors could be so that we can mitigate them and kind of use the outputs that we have in a smart way. In a slightly more optimistic sense, if we know what we get from different sources of data, this can help us combine them in a smart way. So here you see an example where we're mapping land cover on the right, but our input data is either really coarse, so this is 30-meter resolution land cover data, or it's really incomplete. The source on the bottom only basically gives us roads and waterways. So we can fuse these together, account for the fact that neither of those two data sets is perfect, and then come out with a model that predicts high resolution land cover with the predictions you see on the right. And an exciting part of this particular framework is that we're getting high resolution predictions in parts of the image where the data and the model support that, but we're also conveying uncertainty through these blurry parts in places where the data is not good enough for us to support high level predictions. So these are some really exciting, well, exciting for me, hopefully exciting for you, directions in kind of generally how do we make machine learning more data aware? And a lot of these are bridging theory and practice of machine learning. So we talked about specific ideas in remote sensing and machine learning with representation and spatial transferability or dealing with domain shift. That's a machine learning keyword that's very relevant here. Fusing data from different sensors and handling and utilizing spatial temporal structures. In the kind of how do we make machine learning systems more aware of different representations of data they might face, that can mean different numerical representations, as we saw in the example just a few minutes ago. It could mean learning with incomplete representation, like on the previous slide. And generally thinking about how do we make machine learning systems data efficient. And all of this work, I tried to keep it fairly high level, but it's all built on really a lot of fundamentals. And this is going in more toward the pre-advising part of the talk, which is kind of where all of this comes up from. It comes from statistics, optimization, linear algebra, geospatial skills, and then it builds the machine learning and the context domain specific work. And it's kind of these types of building blocks and these types of skills that end up being very fundamental in the work that I do. And so those are the types of things that I look for when I'm looking for PhD students and postdocs, which actually am because I'm starting at CU next year. So if any of you are interested in statistical or geospatial machine learning methodology, as well as context-driven research for real-world problems, there might be a good fit. And I bolded the "and" here on purpose, because either of these bullet points on their own can be extremely challenging research domains, and adding them together kind of only multiplies the challenges. But in the end, it is really, really rewarding space to do research. On top of that, it's important to want to work in and actively foster a lab environment which is doing innovative, sometimes but not necessarily interdisciplinary research in a collaborative, supportive, and communication forward manner. So if anything in this talk was really exciting, you can find out more about applying or reaching out at my website, which is just myname.com. And then this is the last final slide. You gave me the opportunity to just rant a little bit on pre-advice. So I'm going to take that opportunity to tell you some of the things that I've learned about what is really helpful in research, especially as you're getting started. And the first of those is reading. Make time for yourself to read research papers, to read news articles, blogs, and textbooks, not only about what you already know you're excited about, but also about things that you might know nothing about, but that particular half hour you spent reading might open up a whole set of new ideas or interests for you. As much as you can, try to every now and then take a pause. I know that life is incredibly busy, especially when you're in school, but it can be so valuable to give yourself that pause time to think about what really matters to you, what problems are most important, what skills do you want to learn, what type of impact do you want your research to have. And I would be surprised if the answer you come up with now doesn't change in the next 5 to 6 years. But thinking about those questions long term and checking in every now and then is the way that you develop that long-term vision. And lastly, I know people are kind of in different phases of their programs right now. If you're looking to apply, you can find out a ton of information on the CS Grad Admissions website, including kind of instructions on how to formulate the best application and opportunities for fee waivers. And with that, we have reached, I think we have a little more than 10 minutes for Q&A time. So this is unstructured. I can answer questions about the content of the talk or anything else that you might have questions about. The thing is, I can't see your faces, so I'm going to stop sharing for this part. Okay, great. So I don't know how you usually do this. I guess just unmute and ask or type in the chat. Either of those are fine.
I know you'd mentioned looking around for PhD students. I don't know about everybody else in this room, but I'm somebody who's a research-based master's student. Is that the kind of thing where you have openings in your lab for people doing an independent study or thesis work? Is that something that you're open to or not so much?
Yes, great question, and thank you for asking. I will next year. So I'm currently based in Boston. I'm doing a postdoc at Harvard, and I won't physically be at Colorado until next year. So that's when I would have the capacity to take on students there. But if you're interested, I have a ton of wonderful colleagues who are there, right? And so
yeah, yep,
I think
that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes. Okay. Someone asked about contact info, and Bridget very nicely put my website there, which has my email at the bottom. You may also find a CU email for me, which I monitor. So either the Harvard or the CU email are good ways to reach me.
Right, amazing. I'll leave everyone open for about a minute or two. But thank you so much, Esther, for joining. I know you're 2 hours ahead of us at Mountain Time, so we really appreciate you attending and giving some helpful tips and tricks too at the end. Your research is super interesting, and our students are really excited to welcome you to Boulder next
Thank
year.
you. I'm really excited to join. It's a year. I'm hoping it flies by.
Yes, well, Boulder will still be sunny and waiting for you next year. So
I'll remember that every time it rains here.
yes, it gets gray in the winter in Boston, so that I know. Amazing. Any last questions for Esther while we have her on the call? All right, well, the contact information to reach out is in the chat now, and the recording will be up on the website soon. So thank you so much, Esther, for joining, and thank you everyone for attentively listening, and we'll see you next week at our next pre-research advising session.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.